Joining us now to discuss the summit, Qinduo Xu is in Beijing. He's a senior researcher with the Pangoal Institution. With us here in the studio, Emira Woods. She's a member of the International Working Group for Africans Rising. From Boston, Ravi Ramamurti is the director of the Center for Emerging Markets at Northeastern University. And an old friend of the show, Paulo Sotero, is the director of the BRICS Institute at the Wilson Center. Qinduo Xu in Beijing, let's start with you. First question has to be, there was a real rejection of unilateralism when it comes to the global trading system, naming no names, but the finger seemed to be largely pointed at the United States. Was this something that the BRICS countries could really agree on going forward?
Yes, obviously this is, I think, a very much impressive collective voice by the BRICS countries, against the practice of unilateralism and protectionism, mostly by the Trump administration. I think it's easy to understand because if you look at the countries like China, India, South Africa, Brazil, Russia, and they are at this development stage, and they are benefiting a lot from globalization, from free trade, and the free movement of investment, from different countries. So I think they are they cared a lot. Not only China, of course, which is at trade war with the United States, but also India, South Africa, like Russia. They are also suffering from the unilateralism and the tariffs imposed by the Trump administration on the steel and aluminum products. So they are also suffering from this practice, and they are very much concerned about whether there will be a reverse of the globalization or reverse of the multilateralism here.
Ravi, to you now. Obviously, India, the second biggest economy at the table, and India and China are going to be the two biggest economies in the not-too-distant future. But as you know, India and China compete geographically in the neighborhood. They have had their tensions. Is BRICS a format where they can come together?
I certainly think it helps to strengthen the relationship between these two countries. Among the 5 BRIC countries, probably it is between China and India that the relationship is most fragile, because there is a mixed interest where they can actually cooperate on some very important things. And this recent issue about protectionism and unilateralism coming out of the US is one of those examples where they both have a common interest in trying to reverse this trend. But in some other areas, they do have differences, and it's therefore a difficult relationship to manage. Now, that being said, having forums like the BRICS Summit is very helpful for the two countries to sit down and look at the relationship, and without having any single issue requiring them to meet, to just go through the list of issues that they disagree on and to sort of smooth out the rough edges. And I think that has been achieved, particularly in the last year, between Modi and President Xi on more than one occasion. And I think the summit is just one more example of that.
It's interesting that they do agree a lot of times, India and China, on the economic front, especially when it comes to multilateralism. Let's just play Prime Minister Modi's comments about the future. And I just want to get your reaction off the bat.
Fourth industrial revolution के विषय पर
India wants to work along with BRICS countries in the area of the fourth industrial revolution. In this regard, we must share our best practices and policies, keeping in mind technical changes happening now and anticipated in the future for BRICS countries and for the entire world. I would like to suggest that our ministers must discuss this in detail and consult with experts when required.
Now, Ravi, Prime Minister Modi, of course, went on an African tour before the BRICS Summit, as did Xi Jinping, looking for new markets, looking for new deals. But also there seems to be sort of a shared vision a little bit about how the economies of the future could work. Is that right?
I don't actually think that is the case. I think the reality is India has not really fully taken advantage of Industrial Revolution number 2. Because number 3 is the digital revolution, and Industrial Revolution number 4 is when you combine digital with the physical. Now, of course, India has done well with Revolution number 3 with its success in the IT and software spaces, but it has really not done achieved its full potential in terms of Industrial Revolution number 2, which is to create a large manufacturing base with lots of jobs tied to manufacturing. Then you get to stage 4, where you find ways to combine the digital with the physical manufacturing. The fact is that China is the only country that really has a good strategy for Industrial Revolution 4.0.
So a bit of catch-up and a bit of cooperation as well. Emira, let's bring in the African voice here, because obviously Cyril Ramaphosa, the new president of South Africa, it was a sort of coming-out ball, if you like, for him when it comes to the BRICS Summit. South Africa's had a lot of problems economically and with corruption. It's always slightly weird for the outside observer here to see all these different countries come together. Where does sort of South Africa's role fit within BRICS in the sort of post-Jacob Zuma era?
Well, I think we have to recognize that South Africa is hosting this meeting. This is now the 10th of the summits of the BRICS, right? As a counterpart to the G7. So the BRICS coming together to sort of have a counterbalance in the global economy away from the sort of U.S., Europe, the what sort of.
Well, that's a low bar, because the G7 meeting was awful.
Was awful, right? We can talk about that as well, right? But the BRICS came out to kind of counterbalance, and I think what you see is a push towards creating a new space where the economies of the future, as they're called, right? These economies that are emerging economies, but also economies where all these countries are dealing with huge inequalities, right? From Brazil to South Africa to China, they have demographics with large numbers of young people, particularly in South Africa. That are finding themselves well-educated but without jobs. And sure, there is now this technological boom and innovation, but underlying that is this fear that this economy is not able to actually do what is needed, which is manufacturing, which is going to be able to actually use this labor force for the future to build an economy that works for all. I think this is the sense coming out of this BRICS forum now, that, you know, there is a lot of potential, a lot of opportunities, but can those opportunities be realized given where things are in the global economy? So what we see are some adjustments to the U.S., particularly the U.S. Sort of looking internally, and these trade tariffs and all that's going on now. But the longer-term agenda, I think there's still a long way for the BRICS countries to go.
Excellent point about the shared development agenda there, and the challenges facing all these disparate economies being a little similar when it comes to the forward. Paulo, dissimilar situation for Brazil going into this summit, because President Temer is on his last legs, if you like. There's an election coming up as opposed to a new president. There has been a lot of economic problems in Brazil. How does Brazil fit in to the BRICS right now?
Well, Brazil has been there since the start. For Brazil, the BRICS is sort of an invitation to better integrate itself in the global economy. As we all know, Brazil has quite isolated itself internationally, especially in recent governments. At the same time, it's an invitation for Brazil to continue to reform internally, to add quality to its economy so it can participate in the fourth industrial revolution. It is a sort of a safe space for Brazil. It has good relations with all 4 countries. It doesn't cause any internal problems in Brazil, and it helps to affirm what is sort of the essence of Brazilian diplomacy is multilateralism. Brazil is a champion, has always been a champion of multilateralism, and the affirmation of it and this denunciation of protectionism, although Brazil can be accused of being a protectionist country in many instances, I think it's important that a leader of Brazil, no matter that he is now leaving president, he is the president, the constitutional president of Brazil, he speaks on behalf of the nation, going there and making a commitment on behalf of Brazilians to fight protectionism. We have to fight protectionism at home. We have to open up, and we have to better integrate our economy, and I think the BRICS provide a great space for that.
Qinduo Xu, protectionism obviously a big part of it. Let's just play President Xi Jinping before I get your reaction off the bat.
A trade war should be rejected because there will be no winner. Economic hegemony is even more objectionable because it will undermine the collective interest of the international community. Those who pursue this cause will only hurt themselves.
It was interesting, before arriving at the BRICS Summit, we saw the Chinese president in African countries, especially Francophone African countries, Senegal, then a sort of darling of the West, if you like, Rwanda as well. What's the message there in terms of China reaching out? As Paulo said, while we have this sort of slightly closing off when it comes to the US.
Well, I think for China, in order to deal with the pressure from the U.S. side, of course, you see retaliatory tariffs from Beijing against the U.S. products. Even within this BRICS Summit, BRICS countries, there's really little for them to do directly to fight back against this unilateral practice by President Trump. But what they can do really is not only the voice, a strong voice, strong opposition against this protectionism, but also for China, they can basically reach out to other countries within the BRICS and also in the African continent to expand the cooperation, to expand the trade and the investment. For example, to export more from the products instead of to the US market. What about to market in Africa, market in India, market in Russia, Brazil? And this offers some relief, I'd say, due to the pressure from Washington on Beijing.
Ravi, you hinted at this before about India being a little bit late to the game when it comes to opening up its trading relationship with African countries. Was this an opportunity for Prime Minister Modi?
Oh, yes, it was. I mean, India needs to also diversify its export markets. And there is also some competition for influence in Africa between India and China. And the fact the summit was taking place in South Africa provided both President Xi and Prime Minister Modi an opportunity to use the same trip to visit some other countries and cultivate relationships in the region. But for India, China is still the major trading partner. In fact, that's true for almost all of the BRIC countries. And this is one of the challenges of how to make this club work. And that is that China stands head and shoulders above all the other countries in terms of size of GDP, in terms of per capita income, where it's now caught up with Brazil and Russia, but is growing at a much faster rate, and has much larger exports than any of the other countries, in fact, more than all of them put together. So this is presenting, at one level, a challenge for the other BRIC countries. How do we find a way to reduce our trade deficit with China? So even as they diversify their markets into Africa or other places, there is still the fundamental challenge. How do we deal with the trade deficit with China?
Qinduo, go ahead.
Yeah, between China and India, many people would stress very much about this geopolitical competition between the two countries. Actually, from the Beijing's perspective, China is not competing with India. I think there's really the lack of trust between the two countries, even the media and the public, the lack of understanding. And the trade between the two countries is too small. There's a huge potential for them to improve. One of the benefits, I would say, for China and India would be because of the tariffs between China and the US. China is actually importing more from other countries, like soybean from Brazil, and also agricultural products from India. India is going to send a delegation next week, to Beijing to talk about exporting more to China. And remember, in the upcoming November, China is going to host the first international import expo. Basically, is opening its market to welcome the export of products from other countries. In particular, for those countries who have a strong relationship from China. And India should take advantage of that opportunity. Software, medicine, and agricultural products that will help actually bring the two countries together.
Let me bring in the Latin American and African voices here. Emira, you both had your hands up, but ladies first. Obviously, there's the Belt and Road Initiative that fits in here too, as well. And Western critics have seen it as a one-way flow. But countries like Senegal, South Africa also see it as an opportunity for them too, right?
Well, it's clearly a one-way flow, right? I think what you see is still a dominance in the trade between, it's oil, gas, and mining. It is those extractive industries where China
raw materials
has
out, yeah.
raw materials out, and very little support for manufacturing,
so
for
how does that
industrialization
change?
in Africa. Well, this is what I think the African governments need to take much more leadership in advancing, right? That there's got to be a change of the relationship. And it's not only a change that's needed when it comes to trade, but there is also a change that's needed in this, particularly the flow of loans that are coming from China to African countries for these large infrastructure projects. So the concern is that African countries will now be saddled with debt for generations to come. So you're almost replacing the World Bank and IMF with another lender, China, that could also create harmful effects on future economies down the road. So I think there are a number of issues that are below the surface, right? Whether it comes to the trade imbalance, whether it comes to issues of this increased loan capacity linked to particularly the infrastructure development of ports and the rest. I mean, I think these are the things that didn't get discussed, at least in public, at the BRICS Summit, but it is responding to those that will have, I think, a much more long-term impact on African economies going forward.
Paulo?
Well, I think for Brazil, the challenge is to add value to its exports of primary products to China.
Soybeans are doing pretty well at the
Soybean,
moment.
oil, iron ore, but
Right.
you have to add value to that. Otherwise, it remains a sort of a colonial type of relationship. There is good news in one area. The Chinese, after being just buyers of these resources, raw materials basically from Brazil, are starting to invest in Brazil and invest in one area that Brazil badly needs, infrastructure. And this is a very important positive development. I think that assuming that in Brazil we are going to complete what we are doing in Brazil very painfully as a democracy to investigate cases of corruption internally, etc., and clean up, you will see Brazilian construction companies going back to the international market and being able to, especially in Africa also, participate in that market. Remember, Nathan, Brazil is the second largest country of African heritage in the world.
Absolutely,
Only
good point.
Nigeria has more people of African heritage than Brazil. So it's a natural relationship, and that takes me to my final point, which is I think with all countries, I think the people-to-people exchanges. China is doing this very well with the Confucius Institutes. They are in Brazil, they are in various countries. I think there should be an exchange of students, of young people, going to each other countries, because that's where you really build a base for a strong and lasting relationship.
I think that's an excellent point. Qinduo, do you want to pick up on this sort of formalizing how we get move on the Belt and Road Initiative? Paulo mentioned people-to-people exchanges. I think African students now, their primary destination is actually China for education. What else should we bear in mind here as these initiatives take shape?
Well, obviously there are a lot of areas we should strengthen the cooperation. For China and India and Brazil, and even Russia, I think it's easy for them to cooperate in Africa with African countries. I think right now one important opportunity for African countries to pick up is really industrialization. If you look at the pattern, from European countries, industrialization shifted to the U.S. and then to East Asia, like Japan, and then to the four tigers, Asian tigers, then to China. And now, actually, the manufacturing they are leaving China to other Asian countries, and they could also come to African countries. So they should pick up this opportunity. And of course, infrastructure is very important. And Belt and Road Initiative is mostly focusing on the infrastructure construction. I think it's meeting the need, meeting the demand of African countries and also Brazil. And China would love to see, the economic growth in Brazil instead of buying raw materials from Brazil, because Brazilian, the consumers could become a large market, not only for Chinese products, Russian products, India. They can basically through trade and investment and help each other to grow.
Thank you. I want to move on to sort of the strategic element of BRICS. Here we have a grouping of nations, some of which are in the United Nations Security Council and some aren't. A lot of people think that they should, those members that aren't should be. It's been a big bone of contention. Let's listen to President Xi Jinping about sort of this multilateralism that he thinks the BRICS nations represent.
The BRICS countries must uphold multilateralism. We should urge all parties to fully observe collectively adopted international rules, and we should treat all countries as equals regardless of their size, address issues that matter to all through consultation, and oppose hegemony and power politics. We should promote common, comprehensive, cooperative and sustainable security, get actively involved in mediation efforts for resolving geopolitical hotspot issues. It is important for us to firmly support the multilateral trading regime, advance global economic governance reform, and increase the representation and voice of emerging markets and developing countries.
Ravi, you know, it's sometimes overlooked, but this is a forum where India has a lot of weight, Russia has a lot of weight as it increasingly becomes isolated from at least the West. Can it have more of a security and political role globally?
I think that remains to be seen. I think it has not quite achieved that role so far. I mean, remember, this is now a relatively young association. It's 10 years old. And initially, they were not sure what the goal should be. I think they're beginning to develop more of a sense of identity and an agenda that they might work on. And this theme of multilateralism and having a transparent, fair, and rule-based global system is one of those topics on which I think the countries can come together and express a strong view. I mean, it's a very powerful image when you see the leaders of these 5 countries holding hands, and it's on page 1 of the Wall Street Journal today. And I think that does convey an important message to the West that these countries are important players and they should be taken seriously.
Yeah.
That said, they're reforming the international institutions to give greater voice to some of these countries. For instance, as you mentioned, in the Security Council, India would like a permanent seat. But you know, these are the kinds of reforms that take a long time to work their way through. But I think the BRICS could be a place where these items are voiced and pursued.
Paulo, for Brazil, it's helpful to be in this sort of big grouping, if you like. They're also seeing tangible benefits in terms of the BRICS architecture, correct?
Sure. You know, BRICS is a diplomatic elevator for its participants.
I like that.
And, but I think the challenge, and I hear in terms of Brazil, the challenge is really internally in Brazil to take advantage of being a BRIC country. And you do that by fixing the fiscal mass situation internally in Brazil, by opening up the economy, by engaging more consequentially, substantially. It's not about going to meetings and making pronouncements, but really building bridges. And there is, in that regard, Nathan, a very good news from this meeting. The new development bank, the BRICS Bank, is setting up shop in São Paulo, Brazil, which is, you know, a presence of BRICS, a concrete presence in the economic capital of Brazil. So this is, I think, this should happen in the other countries. And as was just said, you know, this is a very young institution. You have to build little by little, by consensus. And I think it has great promise if it's done that way.
Qinduo Xu, just going forward, last word to you. In terms of the future of BRICS, where do we see it going?
Well, I think obviously they are going to play an increasingly important role in balancing the global order in terms of the relationship between emerging economies together with the developing countries and the developed industrial powers, European countries, the United States. For example, UN Security Council, you know, if you look at all the countries, you know, in addition to China and Russia, who are members of the Permanent Five, and India, Brazil, and South Africa, they all have the potential to become a permanent member in the future with the reform in the UN Security Council. And obviously, they are also calling for this balance in terms of the voice, in terms of the representation in the other international institutions like IMF, like World Bank, the governor, things like that. So I expect to see a larger role to be played by emerging economies.
Well, that's all we have time for. Thanks so much, Qinduo Xu, and all our other panelists here. Building one BRICS at a time. Thanks. That's all we have time for. But the conversation does continue online. Chat with us about this or any other show on Twitter. We're at CGTN America. Or visit us on Facebook. That's facebook.com/CGTN America. I'm Nathan King in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for being with us.